Welcome back to Bringing Home the W. Where we're at right now at this point is, thousands upon thousands of submissions were sent to nameyourteam.ca, and a cross-functional team was put together to shortlist these names, and lots has happened, so we're going to bring you up on all of that. But today's episode I'm really excited for because we're exploring names that didn't quite make the cut. So we actually get to sort of ask the questions of why not these ones? And we're joined, of course, as always, by Josh McConnell, our inside man, and we've got Khaleed Juma, a partner at Mettle, the creative agency tasked with building out this Name Your Team campaign. Thanks so much to both of you for being here. How are you?
No complaints. Thank you for having me.
Okay, so Khaleed, I need to know, I grew up outside of the city, about an hour north, and we'd always drive in to come to do something or another, go see my grandparents. And between my siblings and I, it was always who could see the CN Tower first. So I did submit to nameyourteam.ca. And did my Toronto towers make the cut? That's all I need to know.
I think we've got a whole episode to answer that question.
Okay, we'll get there.
But you, alongside of thousands of Canadians, are probably asking themselves the same question right now. And while we can't at this stage tell you what the final shortlist is, we can talk about some of the names that had to hit the cutting room floor. And I use the term cutting room floor so deliberately because the cutting room floor is kind of an exercise that editors or musicians use when they have to begin to refine something, when they have to get it to a place of singularity, when they have to get it to a place of simplicity. And the exercise is tough. You've got to often pull apart things that you're very attached to. And, Josh will probably tell you a little bit more about this, but this hasn't been an easy process. Canadians really overwhelmed us with positive, great suggestions. And it has been really tough internally for us to go through this, whether it be through layers of counsel that have been a part of this conversation, layers of leadership that have been part of this process, internal discourse to begin to kind of pull things apart. And more importantly, land on the name that is right for this team in this moment, in this context.
To reiterate, none of the names that are on the cutting room floor are bad names. They just didn't necessarily work for one reason or another. So can you tell me a little bit about who were the people and who are the players involved in narrowing this down?
Of course. This has been a process like no other in terms of how many participants we've had. And I think unlike other public voting campaigns or crowdsourcing campaigns where you see something posted and you just, upvote it to the top and you end up with Bodie McBoatfaces, which I'm sure has been referenced on this podcast before. This wasn't that. The reason it's important to acknowledge that is because there wasn't a wrong suggestion. Your suggestion might have been right for you, but ultimately when we started this process, we had to lay out a set of criteria that matched what we were building. And we're going to be Canada's first WNBA team, while rooted in Toronto, still playing across the country. And when you add that into the fact that the WNBA is a North American league and sports are no longer just absorbed in their localities, but across the world, our criteria has led us down a path where we've had to be a little bit more selective and mindful, objective at times and subjective at times, to get to our final shortlist. That actually, maybe this is too much information, is slowly going into design. So exciting things happening on the other front.
Okay, this is great. No, we did hear from Dr. Anna Rita Moray, you really have to, she's used the term kill your darlings, right? So it's really interrogating what's the mascot going to be like? What are people going to chant?
Building on that, let me just say that those two prompts are absolutely spot on. We do this exercise called universe building. We take a name and we treat that name like the seed of a garden. When we water that and we give it sunshine and nutrients, does it become a full-fledged garden? Does it have the potential as a seed to become a chant? Will someone immediately know how to refer to a player? Will I immediately know or be able to see what goes onto that hat? Will fans know what to call themselves? And that's part of what we call our brand universe test. And it's been really fantastic to be able to test the fidelity or the potential of the world. And that was a big part of getting to that final shortlist.
So what's your initial filter that you would take these names through?
So there were a couple of categories of names that we explored, and I think it's probably helpful to go category by category and just talk about why certain names weren't necessarily the right name for this team at this moment. The first category is probably going to sound like an easy category, but it's an important one to acknowledge, and that was existing names. So there were a number of names submitted that currently, from a trademarking and licensing standpoint, belong to other teams. So the Rockets was suggested. And I love the Rockets because the Rockets speaks to flying to the sky, through the sky at an incredible pace. Sorry, but the Rockets belong to the Houston Rockets. In that space, we kind of looked at all the things that already existed and kind of had to take a step back and say, while the intent of these names was right, how do we take the spirit? How do we take the idea that people are excited about Rockets, people are excited about Flames, people are excited about Titans, carry that forward, but have to say no to those kind of the names in that bucket. So that was bucket number one. And sadly, we watched our first round of names hit the cutting room floor there.
And I think another one to bring up, too, that we saw a lot of was Huskies. And Huskies is such a great nod for a basketball name. As we know, it's, Toronto's first professional team before the NBA. It was the first game of basketball that was played here. But as we know, the Raptors recently had that as their alternative jersey, and the NBA owns the rights to that one.
Well, speaking of Huskies, let's go back further to the Edmonton Grads, who were like from 1915 to 1940, like most win percentage women's basketball actually in Canada. Did someone submit something along Edmonton Grads
We
lines?
saw a number of grad submissions, and they were great. And what it actually did was it caused us to look deeper and deeper into the history to figure out if there was a thread that we could pull. So the short answer is the Edmonton Grads is not one of the team names that made it through as a finalist.
I mean, Toronto Edmontons, I don't see it, so I can understand that.
But I will say, when we dove into that story, in line with a lot of what you just shared, there was a story of tenacity. There was a story of breaking through ceilings. There was a story of firsts, and we took that energy forward. So maybe the name didn't land, but the spirit has definitely been brought into kind of the next part of this process.
And the one of the winningest teams, like their winning percentage, hopefully that also rubs off on.
Incredible story. For those of you who don't know about the Edmonton Grads, please go take a look.
Okay, let's segue now to the Raptors. We have the Raptors already. There's no onus for us to be the pterodactyls.
So the next bucket actually was dinosaurs. I think that there was a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm built primarily from the success of the Raptors. The Raptors are an iconic franchise, but at the same time, our goal wasn't to build the Raptors. Our goal isn't to build the Raptors. Our goal is to build Canada's first WNBA team. With that said, there are lots of examples of sibling teams in the league. The Warriors and the Valkyries both share a form of identity, Warriors and Valkyries being kind of the women's version of that for the WNBA team. But in this instance, we really wanted the team to stand alone. We wanted to stand on its own 2 feet, and we wanted people to have it remembered for what it could be remembered for. With that said, there were a number of very clever, very interesting Raptor-oriented dinosaur names. I didn't know this at the time, but one of the names it suggested was the Terror, and a Terror refers to a pack of T-Rexes. Again, Interesting alliteration with Toronto Terror. The other one that kind of came up, and probably wouldn't make it that far, but I'm curious to get your POV on this, Tanya, but was the Raptorettes.
Cringe. We're not like the little sister of the Raptors here, right?
And again, nothing wrong with that, because I think that the idea that someone wanted to see the Raptors and this team become siblings is an interesting space. And I think what we took away from that was people are ready to see a WNBA team thrive in the city and kind of go down that path. There were a couple other dinosaur references, pterodons, amongst others. But for the most part, the bucket number 2, if you'll call it, of dinosaurs really wasn't somewhere where we were comfortable playing based on the criteria we had set up and where we wanted to take this team.
And the Raptors came about in such a, for our millennial listeners, that was of the moment, Jurassic Park, right? That was the zeitgeist of what was going on in the world, the most popular thing. And I think we've gotten past that. And I think, we don't need to be the Triceratops or the pterodactyls.
However, you bring up a really interesting point, which is pop culture.
Yeah.
And pop culture played a significantly important role on the Raptors being named, with Jurassic Park being one of the most important movie franchises of that era. And we also, in another category, got a whole selection of pop culture names. Names like the Swifts, named like the Queen Bees.
I mean, I'm a big fan of Beyonce, so I'm down. But that's probably why I'm not on your creative council cross-functional team, because anything Beyonce, I'm like, okay, let's do it.
And I'm certain, based on the number of suggestions we got, that there were a lot of people who also felt the same way. Every single name that we saw was an opportunity to take something away and add it to where we were going to hopefully land this plane. And I think when you look at the subcontext of why people put Taylor Swift and kind of Beyonce into this mix was exactly that. Incredible role models. Powerful women who we look up to, powerful women who have set their own courses. And I think that that's also something that we want to make sure is built into the name, but more importantly, built into the DNA of the team.
Also, pop culture is a important piece, but like if you look and dig deeper, like the other couple that we saw really jump out was Dragons and Wolverines, which, while different from, Swifts and Queen Bees, but it's still there where it's timely, it's relevant in pop culture right now, but they project this image of power and top of the food chain, so to speak.
I will say there was one other really interesting pop culture reference, the Twisters, for all of you who are probably kind of tuned into the Hollywood blockbuster releases this summer. And while the Twisters was an interesting name, did have some interesting alliteration, it kind of just felt like we were teeing up a series of bad playground jokes just waiting to happen.
Yeah, and we get, we're in Tornado Alley. Josh and I both grew up outside of Orangeville, and we had tornadoes. And then, so it is kind of climate, I think. Was there a lot of, climate change is happening even with flames, right? You talk about forest fires and
Totally.
all these things.
So that's actually a perfect segue into another category, forces of nature. So there were a really great amount of suggestions in this space. But what we saw in some of the submissions that weren't submissions to names was people sharing what they wanted this team to stand for. And a couple of people came back and really prodded us in a way that we hadn't thought about. They said, we aren't just the North and we aren't just cold. We're like, that's a really interesting prompt. They said, as Canadians, we experience 4 seasons. And while nature does play a big role in our identity, please don't name the team something cold because that's not who we are.
Agreed. It's hot out today. It's beautiful.
Totally. And we saw lots of really fascinating names because I could easily see how this team could be called the Flurry. We come at you when you least expect it. Our play is blinding. I could see how we could be called the Chill or the Freeze or the Ice. All really fantastic names, but didn't necessarily feel like they were incredible names that only we could own.
And also, frankly, that basketball can own. There's other sports that, fit itself quite well to ice and cold.
Super fair.
Our national sport, our national winter sport.
There's also one big other glaring detail that made this clear to us. The W plays in the summer.
There you go.
28 out when you're going to a game.
Yeah.
And something felt contradictory about naming us something cold. With that being said, there were other great names that had to do with weather. Wildfires was a really interesting name. When you think about the context of a wildfire, strike when you least expect, tough to manage, spread quickly, but at the same time, wildfires have had devastating impacts. And there are countless parts of our population in Canada who have been negatively impacted by their consequences.
Right.
But the more we went down this path, we realized that weather wasn't necessarily ownable to us. While exciting and lots to pull from in terms of how nature works, and all natural force, powerful, Mother Nature as an idea, this wasn't just a space that was exclusively ours to play in, but we did take a lot forward into the way we looked at this process.
And I do appreciate that there was that sensitivity to how hearing that name could trigger other people as well, with people who've been affected by forest fires or storms or lost their homes or lost their livelihoods or all of this. So I do appreciate that sort of taking that, exploring it and seeing what grew from that seed that you planted. But, it might have just been a bunch of weeds.
And this was an important part of Dr. Murray and her team. They were incredible in this process. They helped us see 3 layers down. This has really been a fantastic process and like nothing I've ever been a part of before. And
to play off of the forces of nature, there was kind of a bit of a space that we did play in a little bit more, that it was less about the seasons. But what I really kind of like to play around with was the idea of tides or waves, because there's this idea of Toronto being a city by the water. And I thought there was a lot of interesting things you could do with the universe there. But rightfully so, it's not an ocean, it's Lake Ontario. We sometimes will go in it, sometimes won't. And maybe it didn't quite fit, but that one did actually have legs, and it kind of went further along in the process than some of the other ones.
Sure. Well, actually, you mentioned the word universe, and I think that becomes a perfect tee up to getting to bucket number 5, is the cosmos.
Ooh.
And this was a big category, largely because we're a country that have one of the largest open skies in the world. Whether it be names like Polaris, references to the northern lights, whether it be references to supernova or dawn or orbits, we saw a lot of conversation around Aurora Borealis, not just in English, but in multiple languages.
Oh, wow, really?
And a lot of excitement there. And I think stepping away from the fact that the Minnesota Aurora exists, and that made this a little bit challenging, the idea that we pulled in the universe is that we are bigger than. This is so much bigger than what is happening on a court. This idea of leadership, Polaris being the northern light, was something really exciting that we kind of ran through. But the reality, when we got into some of these names, was they just weren't quite going to land in the same way. One of those reasons, and one of the names that came up repeatedly, was this idea of the stars. But we've got the Scarborough Shooting Stars, arguably one of the most important Toronto franchises playing basketball today in the Canadian Elite Basketball League. And who are we to steal any thunder or kind of ride up alongside of that? They're on their own kind of comet, if you will, and didn't want to kind of disrupt that in any way. We saw another submission, which was this idea of the asteroids. But when you began to test the universe, go roids go was a little tough.
Or ast. Go ast. Or roids. I don't know. Yeah, it doesn't really chant.
But again, it wasn't wrong, right? The idea of asteroids being these powerful things moving through the universe at hyperspeed that have the ability to destroy planets. And we fell in love with that. I think there was a lot that we were able to take away from this category as we kind of looked forward and began to apply these things into new spaces. I think category 6 jumped us into another component of nature. And this was this idea of animals. This included birds of prey. This included...
was raccoons part of it?
Okay, so raccoons was a part of it. Raccoons made it into 2 categories. So I'll start with the second category that raccoon made it into was Toronto icons. Okay. But let's just talk about raccoons for a split second.
Okay.
Raccoons absolutely made their appearance. And you could tell that Torontonians specifically have had a long and shared history with raccoons. I personally love raccoons. I think that they're incredibly smart. They've got opposable thumbs. They're very clever creatures. But my neighbor who has had their garbage toppled 6 times or their attic destroyed doesn't feel the same way. So there's a bit of a love-hate relationship there. The reality, though, is when you look at raccoons, while they are adorable and cute and kind of cuddly, in general, what we gauge from the sentiment was that we tend to see them as a bit of a nuisance.
Yeah, you don't want to get too close to a raccoon.
They're not making our lives better or necessarily serving as aspirational creatures. And maybe once upon a time in a world before we lived in Toronto, they lived differently. But at this point in time, raccoons, aren't necessarily leading the way as role models in the animal kingdom that we wanted to build a team name around.
Fair.
Going back to some of the other names from an animal standpoint, the monarchs. We fell in love with the monarchs. We fell in love with the monarchs because of the butterflies. We fell in love with the monarchs because of this idea of strong, powerful women.
Royalty.
But we also love the Mississauga Monarchs. And the Mississauga Monarchs is running arguably one of the most successful player development programs in Ontario right now. And they deserve all the shine.
Yes.
And didn't want to tread into that space. We also had a couple outliers in there. So vipers came up a bunch. And while snakes are fast and stealthy, in many cultures, they're also a sign of deceit. And that didn't necessarily feel like a place that was an all-around kind of 10 out of 10 across the board. And we saw, I think, 2 others pop up a fair chunk. One was foxes.
Sly fox, silver fox, foxy lady.
There were a couple of connotations that fox conjured that didn't necessarily feel like a clean win. And then geese and loons. So while geese and loons are majestic birds, they don't necessarily scream national champions.
No.
Maybe they do. But when we thought about what this team was going to be known for, we wanted this team to be known for winning. We wanted this team to be known for bringing home the W.
Honestly, my university campus was overrun by geese, and they would attack. And it brings, like, I think I have, like, trauma I still have to deal with from these geese attacks. So
You're faster because of geese, but
Yes.
maybe not the right team name.
No.
We have Deluni, and we don't want to, take anything away from the Canadian Mint, so they can have it.
Very few wins, right? So let's keep the wins rolling on that front and not get in the way. But you did touch on raccoons, and raccoons opened up this whole other category. We saw a lot of Toronto icons. And Toronto icons were an interesting space. People have attachments to them, just like you described with the towers. On a personal note, I moved to Toronto in 1994 from London. And when anyone asked me about Toronto, I told them about the CN Tower. It was just like the thing to do. And then I would talk to them about Niagara Falls too. Those were like two big things that as a 10-year-old, I was like, well, this is how I rep Toronto. I've since learned that Toronto is so much more than the CN Tower, and Niagara Falls is not Toronto. But this is Canada's first WNBA team. This team will play across the country. And as a result of that, building something that was exclusively around a Toronto landmark felt like it didn't do justice to the moment in history that we're living in.
Right.
At this moment in time, we are Canada's team. And we have an opportunity to go beyond just needing to name ourselves around something so Toronto-centric. There'll be times we'll refer to the team as the X, and there'll be times that we have to refer to the team as the Toronto X. But I think when you think about the Raptors, they're the Raptors. So yes, the Toronto Towers came up a lot. It's one of our proudest landmarks. It's one of my personal favorites. But at the same time, the CN Tower is no longer the world's tallest freestanding structure.
Yes.
It's now number 2. And this team is striving to be number 1.
Okay. Mic drop. Okay. I forgive you for not choosing that name. You made it clear. Also, there's other considerations. Tower means other things to like people in America, right?
Totally. We are a North American league, and the concept of towers does have an entirely different connotation attached to a very tragic moment in history. Then we saw things like smoke and Big Smoke. And just out of curiosity, have you ever heard Toronto referred to as the Big Smoke?
My parents are from the 60s, grew up in the 60s. And so the Big Smoke, Hogtown, these are all older names. I mean, then we came the Six with Drake.
100%. So what you're referring to right now are really fantastic colloquialisms that belong to generations.
Yeah.
And when we dug into this, there wasn't a single 15-year-old who knew what the Big Smoke was.
Right.
And we realized that if we're building a team that should transcend generations, we would love to have fans as young as 2 and as old as 92, if not beyond. We needed a name that felt universal and unifying versus a name that felt like it was part of a generation. And we had that opportunity. So when you're designing on a blank canvas, you really do get to kind of talk about these things. What was clear to us in all of this, and all these kind of names like the Naismith, again, another Toronto-centric name, but can you picture yourself with Naismith rolling off the tongue? Maybe not as much.
No. And what would the mascot be? Then what is a Naismith besides, the inventor of the game's last name? But it's so abstract in that sense, right?
Totally. And there are other ways to kind of pay homage. Does the color peach make its way into our system in some way in homage to the peach buckets? Clearly there's a heartbeat here and there's an excitement here. We must make sure that we do right by the people who see this as being, yes, Canada's first WNBA team, but also having its initial home in Toronto while still playing games across the country, and being the first team, again, for the country.
I like that sort of the sensitivity with the weather you were doing, but also I like the sensitivity with the generations, right? I don't even know what Gen Z is calling. I come from the Bacardi slang, T-Dotto,
Totally.
The Six, obviously, I think the Six is done. There is the Toronto Six that already exists, and they're killing it.
Totally.
But I is there a name that, boomers will like, millennials will like, Gen Z will love, and then maybe in however many years they win the championship with that team?
Totally. What you're hearing and what we've learned through this process is timeless is important.
Bingo.
Something that can stand the test of time, something that belongs to anyone, something that can span an an age spectrum is really important to this process. So I think with that, we might only have one more category of names that we haven't really talked about that didn't necessarily land into our shortlist. And that final category is built around this idea of mythology, whether it be indigenous mythology, Greek mythology, Norse mythology. There are some fantastic contenders in this area. And when we went through this, we got really excited about a couple of these. Some of these, and again, many of these submitted in languages that weren't English, that also spoke to the composition of the people participating in this. And we began to look at what each of these figures stood for. There were people who stood for love. There were people who stood for fear. There were people who stood for like being on the offensive versus being on the defensive. There are people who stood for their lure. And
there was also some of their weapons as well. There was or defensive as well. Like so, there's shields, arrows, and things
actually,
like that.
Let's talk about shields for
back.
a second. Shields was a fascinating one.
The Canadian shield.
Shields.
The rocks.
Yeah. So shields really spoke to a number of layers, and it also began to speak to the style of play, like that whole idea that the key to a great offense is a great defense. And we kind of began to explore this a little bit further. And as we began to kind of chip at it, it began to not necessarily stand the test of multidimensional time, if you will. It began to sound a little too singular versus giving us a space to kind of really describe this strong, dynamic team. So shields was an interesting one because it spoke to strength. It spoke to holding our ground. There was another interesting one, which I didn't know much about, the Morrigan.
Sorry.
The Morrigan is a Celtic goddess of war, death, and fate who could shapeshift into animals.
Ooh.
So all of a sudden we're like, hold on a second. Is this our linkage moment? Can we be the bears, wolves, raccoons, the X, the Y? Because actually what our team name is someone who's able to meet the moment in any way, shape, or form. And we fell in love with this for a split second. And then we're like, hold on a second. This is just a little too flexible.
How do you spell that also? And like, how many letters do I have to fit on a baseball hat or I guess a cap, you know?
And the idea got us excited, right? But that's just really too much to explain.
Yeah.
And when we did this test again, can I explain it to my grandparents? Can I explain it to my 3-year-old?
It should be self-explanatory in a way. Like you say it and it's like, you know it. I shouldn't have to read your artist statement to understand why this team is called this way, although it's good to have.
Should there be Easter eggs packed into this? Absolutely. But Teresa, at the beginning of this process, challenged us to 3 things. Can I say it easily? Can I read it if I've never heard it before and say it easily? So phonetically, does it make sense? And when we get to a logo, can I draw it myself, making it a universal symbol? And I think the Raptors claw is a fantastic example of a symbol that you can draw yourself. There's this whole space of ideas. So if you look at the W today, you're seeing these abstract ideas, names like fever, names like sky. And while sky is a reference to the Chicago skyline, it means so much more. There's so much to play with inside of that. And this group of names really opens up the aperture to multiple meanings, to layers. But the challenge with this group of names is, if not explored correctly, they become too big too quickly. And you run the risk of being too many things to too many people. There's something quite powerful about a singular name of something I understand. Go Raps Go as an example. And granted, we had to learn what raptors were, and the movie helped do a lot of that because they were, again, prehistoric creatures. But they were singular. They were really easy to wrap your head around, and some of these names become a little bit more of a challenge. We also saw this really exciting space around riot and rebellion and renegade. And it got us pumped. This idea of people pushing, driving, not taking no for an answer. And as we got into this, we really fell in love with the defiant spirit. But where it became a little bit of a challenge for us was riots and rebellions are usually against something.
Yeah.
And we want this team to be known for what it stands for, not for what it stands against. Yeah.
And just right away, there's negative connotations, obviously. Even though, the WNBA is they're happy to be activists and that I think that the league is built on that, having that voice. But yeah, I think you can go further with a name and not have that negative connotation right away, which, causes people to think so many different things. Either they're like, I love a riot, or, I love that the first Pride was a riot, right? The Stonewall riot.
100%.
I think there's a piece there too that kind of speaks to when we come back to the pop culture ideas with like Swift and Queen Bee, where you can kind of, the question behind the question is like the standing for something and that kind of spirit of, when backs up against the wall. So I think there was an element of, we could still take inspiration from it, but yeah, like as Khaleed said, there's just that element of what do we want to stand for?
Well, there was this other idea in this space, and it was vibes. And there was so much discussion around vibes, because you know what we mean when we say vibes.
Yeah.
And it felt unifying. It felt positive. It felt very Torontonian. It felt inclusive. What it didn't feel like was a name that represented a group of world-class athletes. That's, again, like what all this has done. So I just want to go back to something I said really earlier in this process, because it's been reinforced with this whole conversation. There is no such thing as a wrong name. Every single name that we got was a gift. And I just, again, thank you to every single Canadian who participated in this process, because you really have shaped the DNA of this team. And when you see this name, it might not be the name that you chose, but I hope what you see is a collection of the values and the suggestions summed up into one thing that hopefully delivers in a way that you're excited, and more importantly, delivers for a team that's excited to bring home the W.
So we did just go through 9 different sort of buckets or categories that you sort of placed, all these submissions in. I'm sure there were some outliers as well, but does that mean, the names on that short list, none of those are going to be under those buckets? Like nothing's going to be pop culture, nothing's going to be Toronto icon. Like, is that what that means?
Absolutely not. One of these names, all of these names absolutely came from one of those categories. So stay tuned. I think the reason we talked about those categories is because they're a classification system for us, and they allowed us to understand the sub-meaning on some of these. There are names that I can wholeheartedly say that we are kind of not leaning towards, or categories that we're less excited about. But all of these categories are in play, and there are some very exciting names that have come through this system. And then there's also a new category or two that have emerged that we haven't really seen on the landscape yet. So excited to bring some new thinking to the table, but also play inside of the 9 buckets that we have today.
Do you have any insight into what's next?
Great question. Where we go from here is we take our shortlist names and we begin to test them against design ideas and concepts. We begin to sketch against them. We begin to explore. We begin to look at color, all with the hope of getting to a number of systems that we can share with leadership, that we can share with council, that we can share with the WNBA, which eventually gets us to our final identity, hopefully pretty soon.
Yeah. We got to know by November, right? So it's September now.
Have to know by November.
We don't got much time, but
just more reason to sweat. I take my hat off to the design team, to the art directors, to the creative team that is leading this process. And I'm also excited about the fact that we're about to welcome 2 new members to that team, 2 new designers that are currently in the process of joining the team, that have been sourced from across a design search. So the team is only getting bigger, more voices, and we're excited about where that takes us to.
Oh, that's fabulous. Yes, because people have been messaging me, even being like, hey, I applied to be one of those designers from that nameyourteam.ca. So you have picked some new designers to bring along for the ride. So that's exciting. So more to come, dear listeners. Khaleed, thank you so much for joining us. Josh, thanks once again for being here. Couldn't do this without you. And I really, really enjoyed this conversation, because I just love... I love that we actually got to a point where we could talk about the names, even if they're ones, that didn't make the cut. But of course, that were still good in their own right. They just didn't work for one reason or another. But they were all...
For this moment, for this time, for this team.
Bingo.